All right, it looks like we're live. Is that correct? Mr. Polsky?
He's on mute, but you're live, Mr. Chairman.
We're good. Okay. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you to members of this joint committee. This is the March 1st hearing of the Joint Committee on Fair Practices and State Personnel Oversight. I'm the Senate Chair, Clarence Slam. We also have our acting House Chair, who is currently Delegate Mark Corman. I think when this committee last met, we also had Delegate Bannon, who was a House co-chair with us, and we never had a chance to say thank you or formal goodbyes to our former House Chair, but I did want to acknowledge him and his effort as my colleague chairing this joint committee over the last 3 years. He has since moved on to greener pastures as the current Maryland U.S. Attorney. We also have a few new members of this committee. I think Delegate Harrison is with us too, and welcome to you. And I know that this is a difficult time because we're actually in the middle of the legislative session. It's very unusual for us to have a joint committee hearing like this during the session, and thus committee members may be in and out because they have concurrent hearings on their own bills that may be taking place, as well as potentially in their own standing committees that may be taking place as well. So we're meeting this afternoon here because of some very serious issues that have come to light and to our attention regarding the Maryland Department of Health. The first of which pertains to threats and risks faced by our local health officer, which oftentimes place them in a difficult position when it comes to following the science, implementing state health policies, and navigating their local jurisdiction in an increasingly politicized pandemic. The second part of this hearing is intended to hear publicly from a whistleblower who has brought forth concerns about the handling of COVID-19 vaccines being administered by the Maryland Department of Health. And when she had brought up her concerns, their supervisors at MDH had experienced and continues to experience intimidation and retaliation. These are very serious, deep-rooted systemic concerns at MDH, at the Maryland Department of Health, concerns that should not be taken lightly, and that's why we're having this hearing. As a reminder to members and to the public, the Joint Committee on Fair Practices and State Personnel Oversight oversees, reviews, evaluates, and makes recommendations on equal opportunity policies and practices, as well as state employment policies and protections. And the intent had been to have this hearing earlier, but with the special session and some urgent legislative business that occurred during the start of the legislative session, timing and circumstances didn't work out, but they have now. And so we're pleased to be able to bring this hearing forward with these witnesses. We had extended an invitation to the Secretary of Health to attend, but he's declined, so he will not be in attendance this afternoon. With that, let me turn it over to my House co-chair, Delegate Corman, to see if he has any opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for really being the impetus for having this important hearing on some topics that have been obviously on top of people's minds over the past 2 years. Let me also welcome Delegate Harrison as one of our new members on the House side. She shared a legislative district with Delegate Bannon, so she's ready to hit the ground running and fill his shoes on the Joint Committee. So thank you, Delegate Harrison, for joining us. Let me also say hello to Dr. Gales, the former Montgomery County health officer. I got so used to seeing Dr. Gales on these Zooms over 2 years, I even recognize that he has a different Zoom backdrop now than he did when he was in that role. But obviously the role of county health officer is one that's extremely important even in non-pandemic times, but one that's also really not well understood. I mean, even today, if I tell somebody about the strange structure, they look at me like I'm crazy, even if they've been reading the names of all of our health officers here in the papers over the past 2 years on a regular basis. And let me also welcome Ms. Ray, who's obviously done a very brave thing in an effort to make government function better for people, which is something that people really would like to see. They just want to see the basic things work right. So with that, Mr. Chairman, thanks again for getting us organized today, and I turn it back to you to run our show.
Thank you, Chairperson Corman. We're going to proceed with the agenda. There are 2 items on the agenda as outlined earlier. The first one pertains to local health officers' employment status and termination provisions. And with us this afternoon as part of the panel, we have Dr. David Bishai, Dr. Travis Gales, Dr. Larry Polsky, as well as Ruth Marana, representing the Maryland Association of County Health Officers as their executive director. As a preface, just for background for members of the committee and also the public, the current law allows local counties to submit nominations to the secretary for appointment of their local health officers. And conversely, health officers can be terminated at the recommendation of the local jurisdiction with the ultimate concurrence and approval by the Secretary of Health, and that's current statute. And so that as background, let me turn it over to our witnesses for this panel. And we will start with Dr. David Bishai, who's the former health officer of Harford County.
Thank you, Senator Lamb and Delegate Corman, co-chairs of the Joint Committee and members of the Joint Committee. Thank you for having me. My name is David Bishai. I am the former health officer of Harford County. I want to tell you my experience from last year. On the morning of October 22nd, 2021, I got a phone call first thing in the morning, says, come to headquarters of the MDH this afternoon. It sounded ominous. And when Dr. Jinlene Chan, the deputy secretary, entered the room with the chief of human resources, it was obvious something ominous was about to happen. I don't have a transcript, but the meeting went sort of like this. Dr. Chan looks me in the eye and says, did you know that health officers can be terminated at will? I interrupted, am I being terminated? And Dr. Chan continued, yes, you are being terminated at the request of Harford County Council. I asked Dr. Chan, why am I being terminated? And she answered, the county council decided that it wants to go in a new direction. Now that wasn't much of an answer, so I pressed her on this. Well, what new direction? What did they say was going wrong? And Dr. Chan answered, that's all I can say. Now, I had just lost my job, but strangely, I felt a sense of peace and calm. It was like stepping off an old wooden roller coaster that was noisy and clanging and beating you up, and suddenly it's quiet. I've been giving up nights and weekends to fight the pandemic and building up my staff morale, and Dr. Chan's words meant that my ride was over. A year earlier, I had been a tenured full professor at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where my specialty is the economics and the quality of performance of public health in the US and around the world. I published 250 peer-reviewed scientific papers, and I gave it all up. And there were good reasons to give it up, but there were very good reasons not to leap into government service. I had a great job as a professor. I was fully funded and I could not be fired. I was comfortable, but at this time in our life as citizens, with a pandemic ruining everybody's comfort and security, I felt that I could not just exert that privilege. So I took a leap to serve. And I gave up lifetime tenure for a job where I could be fired out of the blue. I took a pay cut, and that Friday in October, my dreams of service were ended. And all of the programs that I built and spent so much time, there was stuff going on that wasn't just COVID, and all of my programs ended immediately. There was no warm handoff, no ability to call your successor and continue any of the programs. So for instance, it took us 6 months with current hiring procedures to recruit and contract with a full-time epidemiologist that was going to be our COVID testing czar. After I was terminated, my successor sent that epidemiologist back and terminated the contract. And so now the county has no full-time epidemiologist. We competed successfully for a $1 million federal grant. We beat out dozens of other counties to get federal money to help our seniors age in place and avoid placement in nursing homes. That HUD grant was put in limbo. In fact, my successor tried to give the money back to HUD, and county council put an end to that, but the program still hasn't taken off. We had a minority health unit that has now been cut in half. We had programs to help staff stop the tradition of favoritism in their progression through promotions. We're back to the old ways. Now, all of my initiatives were gone, no way to continue it. And that's actually put the health of the citizens worse than when I started. Now, you would think that the headquarters, the Department of Health, the secretary, deputy secretary would ask about continuity and ask how terminating me might affect the health of the citizens. And I hope, but there's no evidence that they looked into whatever allegations they were hearing from the county. If there had been any type of investigation, I think they would have called me. They never did. So no calls from the secretary about whatever it was that the county wanted to change in this new direction. So I tried to piece together the backstory, and I realized that there was a closed door vote to terminate me that had happened 3 days before, and it went on partisan lines. When the county council was asked for why they terminated me, they have never said why, and they've always said that this is a closed matter. Now, I wrote to the Harford County Aegis, the newspaper, asking for a public hearing. I have nothing to hide, and I would really value sunlight on this matter. But the county council and the Secretary of Health clearly do not want to offer an explanation. In the absence of an explanation, there's pretty obvious background story here. I was targeted in a Twitter campaign and made the scapegoat for simply being the face of enforcement of the governor's executive order and the MDH policies. The rage tweeting really was started by members of the House of Delegates who took the opportunity to be in opposition to me for whatever political gains that gave them. There was an event where I'd given scientific and medical advice about the level of aerosols coming out of trombones and clarinets in a marching band. And the good advice is, if you want to stop aerosols containing COVID during a time of high transmission, you really do want to protect the students in a marching band. And I simply gave the scientific advice, but that gave prominent politicians a chance to posture and say that they were in opposition to public health for whatever political gains that gave them. After the delegates did that, there was a regular minority group of a couple dozen people that would go to county council meetings. They would hold up signs in front of the county council, and they would give raging speeches about all of full of scientific misinformation and asking for my resignation. And then you could see county council dipping its toes in the water, also adding to their skepticism that MDH policies were effective and getting a lot of applause for it. So over the summer and into the fall, it seemed to be that they were making a political calculation. In private to me, when I asked every member of county council, how am I doing, and weekly phone calls with the president of county council, there's no indication that they're unhappy with any particular policy. I saw the protests and I said, should I worry about this? And county council president said, don't worry. But clearly, internally, there was something else going on. Now, we should talk today about, what this system is doing and not doing for the people of Maryland. How the process of even asking if health officers doing their job is a question that was answered in my case solely by politicians, and it did not appear to be informed by people with a health background. So the backstops in the Secretary's office failed to push back or ask, as far as I can tell, because they did not seem to launch an investigation that included me or any of my senior staff, as far as I know. So they did not back up their local health officer, as health officers were employees of the state. We're the arm of the state to try to get local policies to follow the state policy. So my termination is only one small example of how this dysfunction played out for the citizens of my county. Public health should not be this hard. Elijah Cummings said it should be easy because everybody wants to be healthy and nobody wants to be sick. We're doing what people want usually. Now, Cummings was right, but he missed the point that there's too little courage in the world. And there are too many people who are willing to seek personal gain. Public health departments that are functional are a gift we give our future selves, and we've disinvested in our local public health departments, not just financially. That's a big part of what gives us the vulnerability, but we've invested morally too. When we find the ability to exploit the political gains that can be made, we're going to lose our ability to have a functional public health service. Now, I'd like to sort of, if there are any other health officers that might be tuning into this, I think I'm going to say what you already know. This year, you shouldn't be trusting that the people at headquarters will have your back. If it's expedient to ditch you, they will turn their back on you. That's what happened to me. So your security as a health officer is all on you. At times like this, you should keep your enemies close. You should be meeting with your protesters. You should be calling constituents. You're going to have to work harder to earn your local mandate to stay in your job. We are working for the people. We are listening to the people. We just need to make that much more obvious because nobody's going to do that work for us. For the people at the MDH who might be listening, I think they need to be reassured and get more courage and confidence to do the right thing. The local talented leadership is helping headquarters, and it shouldn't be threatening to you. If you backed us up, you would get more of what you're looking for as headquarters. And if there are any politicians running for office, I'm just reminding all people running for elected office that the pathway to your dreams for a better Maryland runs through your local health department. If you want a stronger economy, smarter school children, more social justice, strong communities, your health officers are busily, thoughtfully listening to the people and convening the people of Maryland for these causes. More politicians should come and visit us in our local health departments, connect with us, and don't just rage tweet at us. Call us, talk to us. Don't exploit us for your own political gain. I'll be back for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bishai. Appreciate your testimony and your telling of what you experienced. Before we go to questions, I think we'll try to complete the panel first. And I should also be clear, Dr. Polsky and Ms. Marana are here for questions only. So if there are questions posed by the committee, they can answer those. Next, we will go to Dr. Gales, former health officer of Montgomery County.
Good afternoon, Chairman Lamb and Chairman Corman and the respective senators and delegates of your respective committees. I am Travis Gales, and I'm the former health officer for Montgomery County, Maryland. I'm testifying today to share my experience as a health officer and respond to any questions you all may have about this experience. I also hope to give voice to concerns that were and continue to be shared by health officers. But unfortunately, many, as Dr. Bishai mentioned, have concerns about their job security and safety and concerns about making those concerns public. My tenure in this role began in September of 2017 and completed in September of 2021, at which time I left to pursue another opportunity in the private sector. To begin, I was hired by then Deputy Secretary Dr. Howard Haft and worked initially under then Secretary Dennis Schrader, followed by Secretary Robert Neal and Deputy Secretary Fran Phillips until their respective retirements in 2020. And most recently, Secretary Schrader and Deputy Secretary Dr. Jinlin Chan until the conclusion of my tenure. During my time, I also had the opportunity to work closely with other members of the Maryland Department of Health, including those involved in a range of different activities from the state Medicaid program, emergency preparedness, immunizations, and opioid overdose response teams, to name a few. I give this context because I, like many other health officers, enjoyed good working relationships with many aspects of MDH throughout our tenures, including in the early stages of the pandemic response. I personally enjoyed working closely with then Deputy Secretary Phillips and hope she's enjoying her retirement, and felt comfortable sharing any workplace concerns I had and felt the backing of at least her place within the department during that time. She made it clear that we were in this together as it relates to the pandemic response. This sense of collegiality and professional environment, however, dissipated significantly from mid-2020 and was no longer present during the latter part of my tenure. And it's concerning that it may still exist and impair health officers and their staff's ability to execute the roles and responsibilities laid out by state law and regulations. The major concern that I had was the overly political nature that the pandemic response took after the decision to reopen the state after the first wave of the COVID pandemic. While I respect and understand that all decisions have a political impact and carry a political lens, healthcare and public health providers are not politicians, and our efforts are meant to provide the greatest protection to those who we are responsible for serving. This concern came to a head when the governor tweeted on August 1st, 2020 at 2:08 p.m. that he disagreed with Montgomery County's decision to mandate closure for private and parochial schools. In his statement, he says that this is a decision for schools and parents, not politicians, end quote. Health officers are not politicians. And unfortunately, this tone suggested a sense that healthcare decisions were being made from a political angle. I personally requested guidance from the secretary and deputy secretary for how to safely reopen schools. We received none, and ultimately that guidance came approximately 1 month later. Instead of providing that guidance and moving forward after this, the provisions within which health officers were able to make such decisions were changed. In my experience, it created an environment of, if you go against what the state proposed, that even if there were allowances for local jurisdictions to make decisions, we would be ridiculed in public, kneecapped in those responses, and not supported in those decisions. This time included a chaotic situation for me as I and the county ended up being sued, and I'm thankful for the representation provided by the state during that process. The lawsuit is a matter of public record and was dismissed in August of last year. It also set off a torrent of personal threats to me, my family, and my staff. There was concern over my job security, and I'm very thankful for the local support that I received in preventing that from happening, as well as the local support in terms of ensuring that those threats did not move forward and increase security for me and my staff. I'm thankful because that support allowed me to not have to cower from standing on principle and doing what we felt was best based upon our training and expertise and ability to execute our jobs without fearing dismissal. MDH became noticeably absent in response or ability to explain how many of those decisions were being made and being explained to us as health officers, as well as being explained to the general public. Moving forward, there was a concern for further politicization of said decisions and a fear that there would be repercussions to each of our own job securities, as well as repercussions to how local jurisdictions received resources. This manifested in concerns of frequently not
We may have lost
Sure.
Dr. Gales for a second there. Dr. Gales, you there? All right, he may be frozen. We can come back to him when his connection resumes, and we can allow him to continue his remainder of his statement. I guess while we're waiting for him to come back, I want to turn back to Dr. Bishai and some of the concerns that he had brought up with the fact that when you look at the pandemic, our health officers are really on the front lines here of trying to implement state policies as well as address the needs of the local counties. And I think it's disturbing in some ways when 7 health officers of our 24 local counties and Baltimore City have left their positions in just the past 2 years during the pandemic. And to me, it sounds as though, based on your testimony, Dr. Bishai, as well as what Dr. Gales was conveying initially, was that the relationship between local health officers and the MDH is particularly fraught. I see Dr. Gales is back. Let me pause there and see if he can continue his statement. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm sorry.
All right, we lost you there for a
Okay.
second. So if you want to rewind by maybe a minute, you were probably talking while we weren't hearing you.
Okay, I will go back to the major concern. This time included a chaotic situation for me as I and the county were sued, and I'm thankful for the representation provided by the state during that process. The lawsuit is a matter of public record and was dismissed in August of last year. It set off a torrent of personal threats to me, my family, and my staff. There was also concern over my job security, and I'm very thankful for the local support that that created an environment within which I and my staff did not have to cower from standing on principle and doing what we felt was best based upon our expertise and training in executing our job without fearing dismissal. MDH became noticeably absent in response or ability to explain how any of the further decisions were being made, not only to us as health officers and employees of the department, but also to the general public. Moving forward, there was a concern again for further politicization of decisions and a fear that there would be repercussions to our job security, as well as response to how local jurisdictions received resources. This manifested in concerns of frequently not having any type of preview or heads up of state decisions, most often finding out about press conferences shortly before happening and not having any information provided until well after the press conference was completed. The concern was that the Department of Health was not being included in guidance provided. We did not know the factors being included in decisions, and were concerned that key representatives from the Department of Health were not being included in those decisions made from a public health perspective. It became, unfortunately, a guessing game and a joke of what was going to happen when press conferences were being developed or announced, and hamstringing local jurisdictions' abilities to develop contingency plans and plans to roll out and explain to our residents what was happening. This manifested in concerns over vaccine distribution, allocation of vaccine sites, decision on mask mandates and vaccine mandates, equity strategies. For example, we were not notified or included in many of those discussions, often finding out about state efforts in our jurisdictions after receiving secondhand information from organizations within our community that were contacted. While this may seem trivial to some, this was and is critical information that is much needed to implement strategies to keep our residents safe and speak to our constituents. In the case of a pandemic, this information could mean saving lives. At the end of the day, workers should have the expectations and protections that they can be held to clear, objective performance standards that inform their retention and not feel pressure to make decisions for fear of retribution and retaliation. That concludes my remarks. I apologize about the technical difficulties, but would be happy to answer any questions that you all may have. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Gales. And we're going to go ahead and proceed with questions now. And I know Dr. Polsky and Ms. Majorana are here to answer questions as well, if there are any that are directed to them. I will start. I think, as I was mentioning while we had the technical issue, that I am concerned that we have lost a great deal of experience within our local health departments, with 7 of our 24 health officers having changed hands and roles in just the pandemic itself. The environment here seems particularly fraught because the pandemic has certainly become more politicized. But it sounds as though, from your testimony, that relations between the local health departments and the state Department of Health have not been going well. It almost sounds as though they're toxic right now. That is incredibly concerning because we're still in the midst of a pandemic and still dealing with its after effects. But I wanted to see how you would characterize the relationship between local health departments and the state health department, because I think the secretary has conveyed previously that all of you have been kept abreast of what's going on and are informed and well aware of some of the decisions that are being made. It sounds as though you have a different story to tell, and if you could characterize how you've seen that relationship, that would be helpful. Dr. Bishai or Dr. Gales?
Well, I'll jump in. I don't have as much of the longer view, and I hope that Dr. Polsky and Dr. Gales jump in. But what I learned during my year was just how much talent we had at local that wasn't being respected or used. I really learned that there is a sense that the locals are more like vending machines for clever plans of the state and not given our due as experts at our local environment, our local context, and our local capability. And I think in the longer view, that's not how it always was. My colleagues tell me it isn't always like this. And we have so much to offer, and I think some of us were able to shine in the last year. But why is that change? I know that there's this power dynamic between, the headquarters wanting to be the boss of everybody, but it's just not good for the people when local talent and local perspectives and context are not allowed into the picture. And maybe my colleagues know better about how to get back to that if there ever was a time when there was much more cooperation. We're prevented from getting talent. Our core budgets are constantly under threat, and we need to grow our capability. And even now during COVID, the core funding that we rely on to get local epidemiologists, communications, it's less than ever now. And that's not what I wanted to see. I thought this would be the year where we do work to build back our lost strength. And I'm really sad that it's not.
Thank you.
I would say again, and I can only answer up until my tenure concluded of September of last year. Really, in a sense, it really was a guessing game in terms of what would be announced, and it was astounding because the impression was that staff members at MDH were not even aware of what was going to be announced in many cases of provisions, and that prevented us from having an understanding until most frequently what would happen is there would be a press conference announced. We would get an email saying, we will meet with you all later this evening to talk in more depth about what's being announced. And that was the information provided. And it was also concerning when we did raise questions again, for example, about vaccine distribution, we were often not, provided with information to develop a better understanding so that we could communicate that to our constituents to help them better understand the processes that went, the rhyme and reason, how those decisions were being made. Particularly when, there were shortages of resources available in the early stages of that rollout.
Okay. I see Delegate Grist has his hand up. If any other members as well want to ask questions, feel free to raise your hand. We'll turn to Delegate Grist. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think the challenge that we've had with these health officers is that they do two things, and the two things that they've been charged with, and obviously it's been brought to a lot of folks' attention during COVID, is because they've been on the forefront more often than they normally are. They do two things. One, they make public policy, and they're not elected to do so, but they still make public policy, and they also enforce the policies that they make. And I come from local government, and I was 8 years as a county commissioner. And I will say too that it was a great job, but I could be fired. Every 4 years is a chance that the public can fire you based on the decisions that you make and how you make them and what you say and what you do. And that's a great thing. I mean, that's, I know Dr. Bishai, you had mentioned that you have a good job, or you had a good job at, working for Johns Hopkins because you couldn't be fired. But, I can tell you that in local government, you can be. And even in the state government, if you're an elected official, you can be fired too. But going back to public policy, and I will say that in those 8 years that I was a county commissioner, the policies that we make, it was governance and not politics most of the time, because when you're in the trenches, when you're making those decisions, it's a lot different than it's state government, where you have a much larger group making policy for an entire state. For us, I mean, the decisions that we were making affected local people, and it was meaningful. And certainly, I missed being able to be able to do that. And so I would call it governance and not politics. Now, the problem that we've had over the last year, and Dr. Bishai, you even said so yourself, that you can help these politicians. You listed about 5 or 6 different causes that you can help them with, and the concerning part of that is that that could be the reason why you were fired. To be quite honest. Because maybe the local elected officials who were elected to make those decisions, that power was taken out of their hands, and the challenge that we have at the local level too is we take a lot of advice from attorneys, from our lawyers, and we don't always do what they say, because if we did, we wouldn't make any progress. But if we didn't listen to what they had to say, then some of us might end up getting in a lot of trouble. So there was a balance there. Sometimes we listened to them, sometimes we didn't. When it came from any of the department heads, the same thing. When it came from the health officer, when they made recommendations one way or another on public health policy, sometimes we listened to them, sometimes we didn't. So, when we were going through COVID, a lot of the decisions, or oftentimes a lot of the decisions that were made by some of our local health officers, the public in general didn't listen to it, or they listened to it, but they didn't necessarily agree with it. And that's what happened, unfortunately. And I'd hate to see anyone lose their job, because of it. But unfortunately, we would have to expect that, because our health officers were making public policy. You guys were making decisions that you were enforcing, and folks didn't like it. So I guess my question is, at some point, now I don't agree with the statement that any job is good because you can't be fired. I think there should always be accountability. But I guess my question is, at what level of accountability would you support for our health officers? I mean, should they never be fired? I mean, should there be progressive discipline? And if that's the case, who would hold them accountable? Would it be the local governing body? Would it be, the health secretary, who's probably not paying a whole lot of attention at the local level, because most of the work that you do really is local. It's not statewide. I mean, what is the answer here to what we're talking about? Because obviously there's a lot of gray area.
Well, I'd like to clarify that we do a lot more than two things. That I oversee, conservatively counting 14 different divisions within my health department. I oversee the largest behavioral health practice in my county. We run maternal child programs. Our health department oversees our county's only domestic violence shelter, all of the environmental health services. So every homeowner, every business owner who has a septic system, we advise, help them in situations where it's not easy to put septic in. We inspect every restaurant, every school cafeteria, and the list goes on and on.
But that's not the reason why there's been conflict there. You understand that.
I do.
The conflict is vaccines, it's the mask, it's the things that have been politicized that you guys have made public policy. You literally made public policy. That's what's in question here, honestly.
Can we let Dr. Polsky finish?
I was just trying to set the stage that
okay, sure. I'm sorry.
The public policy is one small part. Actually, it may be what's most politically visible, but it's a relatively small part of our jobs, and that the vast bulk of our jobs are truly fundamentally health. And that's why you have not someone elected to office who's most popular, but you have people who are very good at the basics of health and science overseeing departments. I can say truthfully that I did not set a single policy during COVID. I enforced the governor's policies. I enforced the secretary's policies. I had no independent authority to make policy. And so I think that sometimes it's not understood that what actually, and this was something that we ran into frequently, that when the enforcement happens, the presumption oftentimes is that I was the one who was generating that policy, not that it was coming from state level. And I think that's where we collectively need to do a much better job in trying to educate homeowners, business owners, average citizens as to how the system really works. And one of the problems that we haven't touched on, which I hope going forward will be addressed, is that, and this is started well before the pandemic, that the staffing at a lot of state agencies, including MDH, has been gradually and progressively eroded. And then we hit a crisis situation with COVID. Now we have another crisis situation with a ransomware attack. And we have an understaffed state agency trying to deal with crisis situations that they're struggling even in a normal year. And so communications break down, support breaks down, because everyone's scrambling to deal with the next emergency. And that collaboration that should happen between state and local, there's just no one left to fill that need. So that, again, when, to your point, yes, certainly we have to enforce a lot of state policies, but there's these misperceptions because there's not good messaging, there's not good communication. So my hope going forward is that we're going to see improvements in the ability for, and I'm not going to single out MDH, but for state agencies to really be able to handle even the routine, so that when, and this, I think the cyber security issue is a good example also, that almost everyone working on that is a contractor. There's not staff inherent to MDH or to do it, to be able to who really understand what state agencies do. And so we have contractors who don't really understand the relationship between local agencies like local health departments, what happens to the state. So Delegate Grissom, I wasn't trying to be contradictory, just trying to give a little more context for what health officers deal with, and sometimes perceptions that lead to more anger at us that are misperceptions from the beginning.
But you guys do make policy, though. I mean, Montgomery County unilaterally went out and said, you know, we're gonna enforce a mask mandate on private schools. And then, I mean, we look at environmental health. You go from county to county to county. They have different standards on septic system mandates. I mean, there is no uniformity. Each one of the counties sort of has their own interpretation of, you know, how they're what they're gonna do. So there is a lot of latitude when it comes to our local health departments on policies. They do create their own policies in many cases. And that can become political. And that's my point, is that it can become very political because there's no way that the public can hold that health department accountable for the decisions that they make.
Delegate, sorry to interrupt, but in my case, again, just like Dr. Polsky, I did not deviate from the state script. I was not making any new independent COVID policy. It was the perception and the exploitation on Twitter that created political favors to the persons who were tweeting this. So attacking a health officer can get you love in parts of the state.
Well, in your case,
Delegate Griss, I think with all due respect, I think the health officers have made very clear that they don't make policy. They implement the policy that's been developed by the state health department, and they execute that policy, and they have enforcement capability within the bounds of the statute, which is clearly articulated in the law.
Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, I completely disagree with you. They didn't answer my question, to be quite honest. And then I gave them two examples of how they went out on their own and created their own policy, and they didn't refute it. So I'll end my questioning there, actually.
Chairman Lamb, if I'm able to
go ahead, Dr. Gale.
Since Montgomery County was called out specifically, Delegate Chris, with all due respect, we are not elected officials. And so the reference that we are subject to being voted in and out of our jobs is different from yours. We aren't elected officials, and we don't carry that. None of the health officers were elected to their role, to clarify that. And speaking of Montgomery County, as Chairman Lamb pointed out, the governor's decision when we reopened in the pandemic allowed for jurisdictions, local jurisdictions, to make decisions on their own within which they felt that would best meet the needs of their local populations. There are policy mechanisms within each respective jurisdiction that are influenced by advice given by health officers, but there are policy making bodies that implement those, including boards of health and so forth in different locations. So I just wanted to provide clarification on that, to clarify that point. And again, to emphasize, we're not elected officials. We should, as any employee, have the right to be able to have objective standards by which we are measured, and be able to have clear understanding what those metrics are and the expectation that we would be held to objective standards in terms of our performance.
I completely agree with you. And if you're going to be given that authority to be able to make policy, you should also be held accountable to that as well by the public, because if the public doesn't agree, or they don't agree with the decisions that you're making as an agency, at some point there has to be accountability. And that's my question. There is none. The local governing body, I guess up until now, I'm supposed that we're going to pass a bill that says local government can't fire our health officers. But you know, we're going to go from very little accountability to even less accountability, it seems. So you're right.
Do you have a question, Delegate Griss? There.
No, I had several questions already that have not been answered, but thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. I just have a follow-up. I think you know, Dr. Bishai and Dr. Gales, is it your interpretation that you were carrying out the state health department's policy, and you feel like you were not supported in that way, right? That you were not making new policy, you were really just implementing policy that had come down from the state health department, and that you were operating within the bounds of whether it's executive order or guidance that had come from the department. Is that correct?
That's correct. And just to the point, part of what you do to enforce the state policy is to try to interpret it given the local context of how the citizens will react. And I would say that we're not asking to be unaccountable. We want county councils to talk to us and say, you know what, that isn't going to play here. We're elected officials. We know that we need to negotiate about this. And we could be fired for insubordination when we say, no, I don't even care. You know, imagine we want to be deaf to the people. That would be bad practice. And we should be fired for that type of bad practice. Please hold us accountable to not reading the room. It's part of good medical practice to know what the people are capable of carrying out. So please fire us for that and tell us that that's why you're doing it. Threaten to fire us if we don't do that. That's not what happened to me. I was listening, I was tuning in, I was answering constituents' calls, I was giving sound medical advice, and I was fine when the school district said, listen, that's good science, but it won't work here. I said, fine, you don't have to do what I say. So simply giving scientific advice, trying to tell people what the best way to do it would be if they could carry it out. They said what they wanted to say. So no, this is not a petty tyrant conducting overreach and having no accountability, nor will it ever be if this new bill gets passed. We want to be listening and accountable to the people. And we just need to be treated like human beings and not whipping boys.
I would add to that, and again, to clarify our previous point, if I'm allowed to, is I think for those watching at home and for the general public need to understand, and despite earlier references to this, any decision, I know I can speak for myself, any decision that I made as a health officer was not something that I arbitrarily did by myself. It was something that was discussed with numerous people, numerous arms and parts of government. And so those decisions were made as groups. I was not out creating policy on my own, running around and implementing strategies that were not well discussed, well thought out, and discussed with numerous folks before being implemented. And again, each local jurisdiction has their own respective mechanism within which to implement those types of policies. I think the other thing to emphasize, to your point, Chairman Lamb, is that, again, all of the actions that were taken were within and consistent with what provisions were set forth, not only by the executive orders during the pandemic, but also consistent with COMAR regulations. As Dr. Polsky eloquently laid out, there's many regulations and responsibilities that we hold that are codified by the state COMAR regulations, and we were acting within that. And particularly, again, when given the opportunity to have local jurisdictions make policies that we felt were relevant and germane to our residents and constituents, that's what we were doing. And sometimes that was not in alignment, at least for us, with what the governor had proposed. But we were the executive orders made provisions to allow for that to happen. And that's what we were doing.
Thank you. And my understanding too is that health officers are supposed to be evaluated by their county governing bodies, as well as the department, MDH itself, does performance evaluations of the health officers. Whether and how often that occurs, I'm not certain, but that is supposed to be the practice. Delegate Corman, you have your hand up. Chairman Corman, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A few questions. I think these are best directed towards the woman from the Association of County Health Officers, because they're sort of about the structure. So first of all, do our county health officers have terms? Like, for example, I get a 4-year term. I actually can't be fired anytime. I get a 4-year term. Do our county health officers have terms?
No, they don't. They're not limited by that. When they're hired, it's by the county governing body, and the secretary makes that choice. And then we actually have health officers who've served over multiple turnovers of county executives, county councils, county commissioners, both parties. We have somebody who's a health officer over 2 decades. Currently, that used to be the norm, where you had health officers that did such a good job at the local level of working with different parties and different parts of the county government, where they lasted for a long period of time.
So I do find that sort of hybrid approach kind of interesting. And I guess I'm curious if other states do it this same way, where the health officer
Yes.
for a place like Caroline County is appointed by the state government.
I work a lot with the other states that do my job in the other states, and it's very, I can't think of a state where actually they do an election for a health officer.
Well, sorry, but I don't mean as opposed to an election, but as opposed to the counties themselves or whatever their local unit of government is hiring their own.
It's very similar to what Maryland uses.
I just to make sure I'm asking the question clearly, most states have their local health officers appointed by state government.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And so can you just help me understand what the role of the local boards of health are? I don't know if it's this way in every county, but in Montgomery County, our county council also sits as the board of health. And sometimes they would take votes on things related to COVID. Sometimes things would come sort of directly from Dr. Gales or others in county government or the Department of Health. But what's the sort of role of the Board of Health, and how do they interface with the county health officers?
Could I ask one of the, like Larry, Dr. Polsky to
Sure.
answer that? And Dr. Gales.
Yeah, so Mr. Co-Chair, there's a lot of variability. I hate to use it, but that's the truth, that the involvement of the boards of health, which oftentimes, but not always, are either the county council or board of county commissioners. In some counties like Howard County, they have a specially designated board that are appointed to those positions. They're not elected. But the degree to which those boards are active is just very, very wide range. I can say in my county that we meet twice a year. That is stipulated by state statute, that in every board of health is supposed to meet every May and every November. And for the most part, it's an opportunity, a formal opportunity on camera. So not only and so my board of health is my county commissioners, but so not only my county commissioners, who I meet with regularly, I just met with them earlier today, that I can also inform the public because it is televised on the local cable channel. And then they have a chance to ask questions on camera for me to answer. But otherwise, for the most part, there's not a lot of consistent activity amongst my board of health. And I think that's typical for a lot of counties.
I guess maybe I'll direct it to Dr. Gales just to understand the difference of when it came from the Board of Health. For us, it was the county council would meet and vote on certain things, and you were often very involved in those discussions, obviously. And then I'm not sure that was true of every sort of minor change that might have happened, understanding that it's all under the sort of general purview of, whatever's allowed under the law and COMAR and the governor's orders and so on.
Yes, so Dr. Polsky again eloquently laid out what is, I think, more often than not the norm in terms of how health officers interface with their respective boards of health. In Montgomery County, it happens to be our county council. I think in other places it is as well. One of the challenges throughout the pandemic response was, at least initially in our pandemic response, based upon the executive order that was laid out by the governor's office, those decisions could be made by the county executives and so forth. And there was some change to that language, if I recall correctly, and forgive me, but if I recall correctly, due to the change in provisions around school closures, as well as language in other executive orders, the powers were changed, if you will, in order for local jurisdictions to be compliant with executive orders, those decision-making powers shifted a little bit. So if you recall, in the early stages, Montgomery County, they were county executive orders that were signed off by the county council, and then it changed to the county council sitting as Board of Health. It was to be, again, to an earlier point, it was those changes were made to be compliant with the executive orders that were laid out from the governor's office.
Thank you. I have one more line of inquiry, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to just go back, I think, to the association again, which is, can you just explain the current state of the law about if a health officer is to be terminated, who has the power to do that currently?
Again, it goes back to the county governing body and the secretary. So it's another joint effort, the same way that the health officer was hired.
So under the law, they have to agree. I'm sorry.
Yes.
So under the law, they have to agree. So as Dr. Gills was explaining, he had local support. So there was no issue.
Right.
Not have the local support, so there was an issue.
That's correct. Previous health secretary gave us an example recently. I think it was in a Montgomery County health officer case where there was the county came to the secretary and said, we want to do something different with our health officer. And so the health secretary at the time said, I want to do a little bit of investigation about it and find out what's happening. So he did that and worked with the county and found out some more details. And they decided we're going to come to some agreement between the county governing body and the state health department and work with this health officer. And they ended up keeping the person, and it was successful. But sometimes the secretary of health just defers to the county and said, this is what the county wants. And so there isn't that investigation. There isn't that dialogue that happens or trying to bring people together.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think I can turn it over myself to Delegate Harrison.
Thank you. and good afternoon, everyone. And let me just say on the outset that being threatened for doing your job is never acceptable by anyone for any reason. And to the extent that any one of us as an elected official incites something like that, then we have to ask, where is the statesmanship there? Because it's just never acceptable. And likewise, someone doing their job should never threaten anyone else either. So let me just say that from the outset. I too come from local government, having spent 10 years on my county council, being staff for 6 years before that. During my tenure, I served several years as the chair of the county council, vice chair of the county council. I served as chair of our Health, Education, Human Services Committee, and I've chaired the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, as well as the National Association of Black County Officials. So I've been in several leadership positions during my tenure. Well, we also, in my county, we sat as the Board of Health. And prior to my tenure, we had not been quite as active as the Board of Health. And so we became much more active, holding meetings as a Board of Health, at least quarterly, if not more often. It has been my experience that usually the health officer has been changed actually during when a new county executive comes in. And of course, there are some requirements to meet to become that. And we had once where the individual was not necessarily a physician, but had met the qualifications otherwise. And so there was a lot of question about that. And Delegate Corman actually got to one of my points was in that, you know, the council, the county executive makes the recommendation. The council says yay or nay, but it is the Secretary of Health that gives the ultimate or the final decision, and that will be the same with relieving one of their duties. And I will also qualify my statement by saying that while I served in local government, we did not have a major health crisis as we've had for the past few years. And so I don't have that experience. But what it appeared to me was that our health officer seemed to make decisions or announce decisions in conjunction with the county executive. And so it would seem to me that those decisions, whatever they were, policies, as Delegate Grice mentions, were done in conjunction with the county executive. And I'm assuming that the county council sitting as a Board of Health were also in agreement. So my question is to Dr. Gales or Dr. Bishai or anyone, when you made your decisions, were they in conjunction with or in consultation, maybe is a better word, with your county executive? And was there agreement with your local Board of Health?
I can speak from my experience. Thank you, Delegate Harrison, for the question. Every decision that was put forward from my office during my tenure as health officer was very much vetted by county executive and county council, and we moved together. There were not any decisions where, again, I arbitrarily made a decision, publicized a decision, and moved forward. They were done in consultation, lots of discussion, and when something was put forward, it was done so with the support of those respective bodies.
The same here in Harford County, although the balance of power in Harford, the county council president made it clear to me that if I would answer to county council and Board of Health rather than to the county executive, although I was on a phone conversation with everybody, it was much more closely with the president of county council, and all of our policies were lockstep with them and cleared with them. And I thought we had a good relationship, but clearly I was expendable and I was expended.
Well, the one thing that I would say is that, in a position such as that, you do serve at the will of, and the right thing to do, in my opinion, would be to have a good conversation, or to have a conversation, as opposed to being surprised by, whatever may have come. And I guess that's just I don't want to use the word tragedy, but that's what happens, I guess, when you do have the vacated leadership. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Delegate Harrison. I had just a few follow-up questions, and then we'll move on to the next panel. Dr. Gales, I think you had cited the fact that you had received a lot of threats as a result of what took place towards the end of your tenure there. Can you A, describe those threats that you received, and B, did you feel threatened or exposed as a result of the governor's tweeting?
Thank you, Chairman Lamb, for the questions. For the first one, I won't go into detail. What I would reference is I have testified before both the Senate and House committees related to bills to add protections for healthcare workers. I believe it was in the House committee. I did share language of one of the emails and types of language that I received. And so I won't reread that. I would reference you to take a look at that. It was pretty explicit in terms of the approach and level of vitriol that people were launching. The concern was that receiving threats to show up at my place of residence and incite, protests and so forth, showing up at our offices, it made it concerning for the staff. So, on my part, I did work very closely, and I'm very thankful for our local police department and county attorney's office, who worked to vet those types of emails and threats when we received them. In coming up with strategies like taking different routes home from, the office to ensure that, we weren't being followed or things like that. We did also increase security presence within our respective agencies and locations, because we wanted to make sure our staff was safe as well, and able to execute their jobs. In terms of your second question, I'm hesitant to not seem that I'm editorializing in any way, shape, or form, but it was concerning. Again, the tweet that I referenced, there was a level of threats and information that received after that incident with the school closures increased significantly. I won't make any comment in terms of tying it to a particular tweet, but I will say that the environment that was created in that moment made all of our decisions seem a lot more political, or political in general, and that fostered in an environment that not only created increased threats towards me, but increased threats towards other health officers, as well as just an overall tone that what we were attempting to do, again, in executing our jobs, was in some way political, and that we were making arbitrary decisions. I'll let that stand for however it may, and hope that answers your question enough.
Yeah, thank you. And this question may be for Dr. Polsky and Ms. Majorana. Given your history here, how would you say that, have you seen prior instances, rather, of health officers being pressured to leave their position or being terminated in similar circumstances before the pandemic? Do you have any historical lens of how this might have occurred in the past? How often, prior instances, or do most health officers kind of surpass the tenure of some of the local elected officials?
Ruth, why don't you go ahead? Because I think you had started to answer this question before.
Yeah, this has not happened. This is unprecedented. I know that's a word that is used a lot during the pandemic, but I've been with MACHO since 2007, and I was with Harford County Health Department for 15 years before that, and I have not seen it at this level before. Health officers do not turn over because they do have a great relationship with the local elected officials at all levels of the government. I mean, some of them even report to their county administrator because of their structure. And they usually they try to bring consensus versus doing things on their own, because you get more buy-in when the community believes in you and has confidence in what the local health department does. So that this is not in any way normal.
Okay. Any other questions from the members of the committee? All right. If not, Delegate Grissom, do you still have your hand up, or is it a new question?
Yeah, actually, it's not a question, but I will wholeheartedly agree with that last statement. And I know that, yeah, I didn't mean to be combative earlier. And I can tell you, out of the 8 years that I was in local government, you know, we had that example. We had an incredible relationship with our local health officer. And obviously the circumstances were much different then than they were now. And I can't surmise how, you know, things would be at the low, because I'm not there now, and I don't know how that would be. But I can tell you in the past, you know, at least in my experience, it wasn't broken. And we had we shared a health officer with Kent County as well in Caroline. So, and from what I understand, it worked. You know, they had a very similar relationship with their local health officer up there as well. So, you know, as they used to always say, if it ain't broke, then don't fix it. And obviously, hopefully, I think we can all agree that you know, this pandemic, hopefully this thing's behind us. Obviously, it's not now, but it will be soon, hopefully, and then we can sort of get back to some sort of normalcy, and we can start focusing on you know, the opioid epidemic again. We can focus on taking care of our local folks when it comes to environmental policy and all that. And then, you know, obviously there's challenges that will never go away. And obviously there's the things that we can all agree that we have to find solutions for. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Delegate Grissom. Thank you to the panelists. I know Senator Jennings had actually offered Dr. Bishai an apology last week during the hearing that took place and for the treatment that he received. I know that meant a lot, and also expressed that to Senator Jennings, appreciated that. I think in closing on this panel, I think there's context that's important here when you look at what's going on in Montgomery County. And I think the county executive had previously said Dr. Gales will probably go down in history as one of the most impactful in Montgomery County because of his response to the pandemic that had taken place. But since he has left, no one has filled his position. And actually, the council president, Councilman Albornoz, had expressed that there were 2 finalists for the Montgomery County Health Officer position who have since turned down the job that was held by Dr. Gales. And to quote him, this is Council President Albornoz, I've recently learned that a second finalist for the public health officer position in Montgomery County has turned down the job because of fear and concern over the rhetoric, over the attacks. And it's a status state of affairs, he said. And so to put this in context, what happened to Dr. Gales and Dr. Bishai is not over. It has implications that continue to today because it's causing strong, well-qualified candidates to think twice about taking on these health officer roles because they don't feel like subjecting themselves to constant threats, not only from the public, but also from the Department of Health that in many ways may fail to protect them. When these candidates lead our local health departments, when these candidates who would otherwise lead our local health departments turn down these health officer positions, I think it ultimately makes our state less safe, especially as we continue to deal with the effects of the pandemic. So I'd like to thank all 4 of you for being here as part of this panel to answer questions and to share your experiences, and wish you all the best.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you all, and please stay safe.
Thank you.
And Delegate Christ, I echo your last comments, and I think we all share those hopes of getting back to a point where, you know, we can resume and look beyond COVID for all the other things that health officers take this job to be able to advance the health and well-being of the members of our communities.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that, Dr. Polsky. All right, we're going to move on to our second panelist, and with us for this is Dr. Jessica Ray, who is a current employee of the Maryland Department of Health, also a whistleblower who's brought forth concerns about handling of vaccines that were administered by the department. And she has her experiences to be able to share before this joint committee as well. With that, let me turn it over to Dr. Ray.
Great, thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me to speak today. My name is Jessica Ray. I was asked to share my experience as a whistleblower within the Maryland Department of Health, and with the long-term hopes of preventing this from occurring again, but more importantly, to communicate that the state mobile vac sites continue to deliver unreliable vaccines and that staff retaliation continues to occur because the MDH recovery program is a broken organization. For a brief background, I'm a doctor of health sciences specializing in global health, as well as a practicing physician assistant for 14 years. I'm a published researcher and have had several years of experience as a subject matter expert for traumatic brain injury recovery. I've also been serving the COVID-19 response and recovery efforts since the pandemic started, from the urgent care to an emergency staffing position with the Baltimore Convention Field Hospital, where I transitioned to the Chief Safety Officer for community testing sites. In September of 2020, MDH recruited me as a clinical advisor to lead testing operations, with my first role as a community testing and infection control lead. My performance in this role as the lead allowed me to provide clinical oversight and policies to all state sites that provided vaccine testing. And then I was promoted from this role because of my level of performance to the state mass vax chief clinical advisor, providing oversight to all the state mass vax sites. While in these clinical leadership roles, I created foundational training curriculum, operational guides, training tools, and clinical policies that are still used for MDH testing and vaccine sites today. I protected the public with implementation of safety guidelines and assessments, and protected MDH by ensuring compliance with state and national requirements. I served as a mentor to clinical and non-clinical leaders, advised government on requirements, developed quality improvement teams, and built sustainable systems to mitigate incidents. I worked hard to create solutions that would meet operational goals so long as safety and compliance were met. My direct supervisor granted me the authority to communicate directives at his level. He often told me that he trusted my judgment explicitly and referred to me as the moral compass of our group, since ethics are the foundation of my clinical decision-making. I worked long days and nights for over a year before taking a day of leave, viewing this phase as a deployment to serve my community, with my veteran Marine husband understanding this mode, and while sacrificing precious time with my 5 children to answer my call to serve. I still feel honored that I was provided an opportunity to help my community during such a critical time, but it should not have come at the cost of public health safety or at the disregard of staff rights. When the state transitioned to the recovery program, the MDH vaccine and testing branches tried to merge into one cohesive program, but the merger was not successful and there was continuous dysfunction from alliances and subversive actions. I was assigned as the deputy director of the prevention treatment branch, which allowed me to provide clinical policy and oversight to all testing and vaccine operations in the recovery program. This aligned correctly with my contract duties and my year-long experience leading MDH COVID operations. However, as I worked to address the usual issues of safety and compliance, I was progressively prevented from being able to execute the purpose of my job because the program allowed clinical guidance to be disregarded in favor of production. We were formally told that the recovery program goal was to meet the vaccine and testing gaps of the community, but they aimed to empower communities to become progressively independent of state resources as we recovered from the pandemic. Simply put, we were supposed to support communities in a way that helped them eventually not need us anymore. This is the right aim so that our very expensive state program could wind down operations and communities could return to self-reliance on their own health department and local resources. However, the true aims of the recovery program became clear to me when I heard leaders casually say, the goal is to stay in business, which is visible when you consider that Mobile Vax is sending $10,000 per site missions to locations where they know less than 25 vaccines or possibly no vaccines will occur, which has been happening for months. These mobile vaccine sites are often sitting right next to a local clinic that's offering the same vaccines. Additionally, in the recovery program org chart, you can see that clinical staff are either a side option for as-needed approvals or at the bottom of the org chart as execution-only staff. In fact, if a clinical advisor gives the wrong answer, such as no instead of a yes, or if a clinical field staff are too critical in their compliance reports, operations staff will move to another clinician to do the job instead. We internally refer this to as clinician shopping. The same practice occurs with internal legal advisors to get around consents and research concerns, for example. This sends a clear message to clinical and legal staff how to maintain their job and what would risk it. So staff that play by these rules are retained and promoted, and those that don't are discarded. This maintains the corrupt legal and clinical leadership. The goal of the recovery program is to continue operations, so guidance that appears to be against this or even threatens to slow things is considered an obstacle rather than an opportunity for improvement. The whole program is run by contractors who know that if the program ends, their job may end. This incentive to invent need is clear and very motivating, as well as very expensive and risky to the public. As a contract-run program, there are no clear expectations for process or behavior. Even though we sign acknowledgement of ethics law and several other state policies, we are not truly held to them. New employees show up unannounced, hired because they are a friend of someone, not because they are qualified. We are unable to fire people that are incompetent because their father is a judge, they are the daughter of the current deputy, or they are friends with an executive. Instead, they hire more expensive staff to support the incompetent staff and remove people that point out these problems. This instability contributes to the unwelcome environment for reporting issues and the inability to gain legal backing if you do report. The main red flag I reported to my leadership was the non-compliance of the MDH vaccine sites, how they were dangerous and illegal to operate because they were not CDC compliant and not properly staffed or resourced. I provided this communication weekly to over 80 staff members, as well as in other meetings, calls, and in person. I was told by the director of the program, quote, "We don't need a Cadillac, just a Honda." I tried to reply clearly, telling him the car is dangerous to drive and needs to be pulled off the road, but nothing ever changed. Leadership retaliatory actions spiked when I voiced these concerns again, as well as concerns about the push to operate outside of CDC guidelines and the ethics of the rushed antibody study. This expedited the removal of my oversight authority, and operations sped up faster than could be managed safely. There were alternatives offered, but leadership was not interested in options that did not meet the true program goal. Instead, leadership skipped key steps of safety, such as required clinical staff training and certificates, and allowed my progressive removal of oversight, ignoring my alerts and giving special treatment and authority to leaders with important friends. For example, the first pediatric vaccine clinic for ages 5 to 11 was at a politically important location where the majority of the clients were expected to be undocumented families. I requested that we push the date at least one day to allow for the staff to be properly trained in pediatric vaccines and to identify a qualified clinical lead from the vendor, or to switch to a higher quality vendor with better clinical compliance since this was a vulnerable population, but I was denied. The result was a clinic run by untrained staff, led by an unprepared leader, and with CDC violations. It was a huge disservice to our vulnerable children. My repeatedly raised concerns and attempts to oversee parts of the vaccine clinics for pediatrics resulted in the new clinical lead banning me from visiting the sites or interacting further with the clinical team that I built. Meanwhile, our operations lead continued to report how successful the pediatric clinics were based on the number of missions per week and shot counts. You've likely heard about TrueCare, but they were not the state-supported sites with the worst compliance. MDH organic sites were, meaning the sites that MDH put together with their own staffing pools. As examples, these sites had operated with untrained staff, no clinical leader, no epi in case of an emergency, and no vaccine tracking at all. People were getting unreliable vaccines continually, but since we were not allowed to cancel sites appropriately, and the goal was the number of shots or the number of people vaccinated, it didn't seem to matter if we could rely on the vaccine itself or not. In the end, if they need to get revaccinated, perhaps it's just meant more business for the program. This has still not been addressed by MDH. If MDH conducted an evaluation of their own sites with the same minimum standards it set for TrueCare, they would have to contact numerous clients for revaccination, starting with the Camden Yard sites from last July. But MDH leadership has denied my request for an internal investigation of our own sites, and the investigative lead who paused TrueCare has not been willing to hold MDH to the same standards. When TrueCare was finally suspended, the MDH organic teams were forced to accommodate the scheduled sites with even less safety measures. Sites were severely understaffed, at times only 1 or 2 clinical people, with the clinical staff who were non-CDC compliant at times. The MDH clinical advisors were made to provide oversight of an unsafe clinic with no power to change the situation. compromising their licenses. They were forced to work continuous days and cancel leave. One nurse was bullied into canceling her anniversary plans and working 15 days in a row under these high stress and long-houred conditions. Even if they had not yet been cleared to provide clinical oversight or did not have the required certifications, they were directed to perform the role anyway, and they were afraid to lose their jobs if they didn't. When my oversight and protection was removed from the clinical advisor program, they were put under the management of a non-clinical person so that their schedules and assignments could be dictated, regardless of the risks. I tried to impress upon my branch director the need to stop the staff abuse, the severe and increasing public safety concerns, and to please communicate to the secretary our limitations. But our leadership was afraid to tell the secretary disappointing news and would manipulate reports to provide a more positive picture. So he was ultimately not willing to relay this information and was angry it would not comply with his dangerous demands. It was during this escalated crisis that I finally filed my whistleblower report to the MDH OIG on September 23rd. The branch director informed me of his plan to demote me 4 days later. When I was demoted from my position, I was given 4 hours to find another office space. My colleagues' jobs were threatened if they associated with me or stepped into my office again. I was sent to a non-existent administrative role where my supervisor was instructed to restrict my work and relayed that I was not allowed overtime because I was overqualified for the role and therefore considered expensive, even though they were still trying to hire 3 more clinical advisors. I was instructed to cancel all meetings, including the meetings that all team members are allowed to attend, and block from team files. The worst part is that the clinicians I've worked with witnessed this clear message and now encourage each other to protect their jobs by, quote, keeping quiet and avoiding trouble. They are not in a safe place to report concerns. Many have reached out to me discreetly, though, in agreement with the issues, but are rightfully afraid to lose their jobs and had chosen to protect their careers and families by suppressing their responsibility as a compliance officer. Also, some clinical leads are more interested in their near $200 per hour pay with occasional double time and get special treatment and pay for hiding problems. Even though I now am completely ostracized in a non-team administrative role, the story repeats itself with our remaining senior compliance officer, who last week was removed of her authority to supervise Spartan. Spartan is our current MDH mobile vax vendor who is assigned the most sites, although they have the worst compliance and they're the most expensive. Our senior compliance officer has also been legally threatened by state entities, and her office was given to a new employee with no explanation or apology. She requested I not give her name today, but she is the most proficient compliance officer MDH has, and if given the power she deserves to have, she would be instrumental in fixing the safety issues by setting the right bar. The retaliation she is experiencing today is completely uncalled for, solidifies the clinical advisor's fear of reporting, and it does not demonstrate the secretary's vow to prevent and address retaliation. Many other staff have also quit or been fired within the last month, and likely they would be able to attest to the examples I give today. Instead, the current compliance leads are not qualified in compliance, and the clinical team lead assists in suppressing safety reports and authorizes non-clinical staff to conduct clinical roles. This unnecessarily increased risks to public safety. The clinical team lead is also the silo for the new escalation process, filtering reports before they can be escalated in awareness. The state reporting process is also a mess. Since July 2021, well before my OIG report, I attempted alerting my command regularly through all proper channels. I also sought guidance from state legal contacts and EEO representatives, but I was U-turned and dead-end before my own research finally brought me to the MDH OIG, where on their main page, the purpose bullets highlighted several areas I needed to report. The OIG, though, initially pushed my complaint to the Audits and Compliance Office, who then later told me that my complaint should stay with the OIG and or add an EEO office complaint by reporting to the Department of Budget and Management. The EEO office then clarified that their job would be to try to refute my complaint and defend MDH rather than investigate an area that needed to be addressed. I submitted this additional complaint to the DBM office anyway, in case it could be helpful. It wasn't until the EEO prompted the OIG that I finally got a response from them 93 days later from my original report, where they stated that my complaint was not in their purview and to try reporting to the HHS. And they did not reply to my request to clarify on why my report did not qualify or provide a copy of their assessment. Every step of the way, each office seemed to find a reason why they were not the right office were not willing to address the portion that applied to them. I even went to the State Ethics Commission, who told me that contract employees are not held to state employee laws, even though we sign acknowledgement of it. Now, 5 months later, after my initial report, the EEO within the DBM and the Audits and Compliance Office are continuing investigations. However, the Audits and Compliance Office report will not be provided to me, and it's internal, meaning it may be dismissed completely. My federal reports to CDC, FDA, and HHS entities were ignored or declined, except for one report to the HHS pandemic hotline. But they just informed me that their investigation will take between 3 to 5 years to complete. So to conclude, please hear me when I say this is not a true care issue, this is not an individual issue, and this is not a past issue. This is an active MDH issue. The MDH recovery program will remain unsafe for the public and unsafe for their staff so long as it continues to operate off a production model that overrides safety and permits retaliation. And I thank you for hearing me today, and I will appreciate any questions you may have.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ray. Let me start off with some questions to try to understand what you were saying. I guess you had cited earlier that there are thousands of dollars being spent on each mobile vaccination clinic when very few people are actually being vaccinated. A lot of these are being conducted by contractors who, I guess, from your perspective, seem to have a self-perpetuating cycle and incentive in this, that they want to keep themselves in business, that there seems to be a perverse incentive to kind of paint the rosiest of pictures in needing these vaccination clinics to remain standing for thousands of dollars per clinic when only a handful of people are coming, and vaccines are now widely available even at the local pharmacies. So at times, these pharmacies may be just down the street from the mobile vax clinic that's been set up by the state. These contractors, I assume, want these clinics to continue, even if demand is almost non-existent, because they have a incentive to continue to build a state for these clinics. And it sounds as though their goal is to stay in business as long as possible to continue bilking the state. Is that accurate based on what you were conveying to us?
That's certainly the mode that it's been feeling like for most of us for at least the last couple months. There have been meetings that have been had to ask, why are we slowing down as if that's a bad thing? Or why are we not getting enough sites? So there are a lot of purposeful sites that are planted by their own operational decisions about where they think sites should be. And some of those are based on maps where they say that there may not be enough vaccines, but there's also just sites happening consecutively in the same place, such as the courthouse, every single week, where less than 10 shots might happen continuously, but it's in a politically important place. So those things happen often. And even though we switched now to a different contract where we pay the vendors a certain price per mission, we are paying now that heavy cost of only having 5 vaccines per $10,000. So that has not improved the issue when it comes to the cost for the public.
Wow. Well, 5 vaccines being administered for $10,000 is certainly disturbing. I know my House co-chair serves in the House Appropriations Committee, and that does not seem like a good bang for the buck for the state. And if the goal of these contractors are to stay in business as long as possible, I find that pretty disturbing. I guess the second issue that you seem to have highlighted is that the MDH organic sites, these are vaccine clinics that are being administered by MDH's own employees, also have a lot of problems, sometimes may even have more problems than the true care vaccinators themselves. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so the MDH organic sites, they come by, sometimes their name changes in the way that they're announced. They've been called the medical response team. They've been called the non-vendor team, things like that. Essentially, those are teams that are meant to be, have a clinical advisor from MDH provide oversight, but the staffing, the number of staff to help supply the vaccinators and the pharmacy folks who man that piece come from a staffing pool of multiple nurses. So those nurses may or may not have worked with us in the past. And the efforts I tried to put forward when I was a deputy to train a certain set of them so that we could rely on their skill sets and reuse the same nurses was prevented numerous times. So we weren't able to get a standardized set of nurses that we could trust and depend on as reliable to do a good job. So those sites are completely under our authority, and there is no vendor involved. We get the vaccines from a local partner, such as UMS, and they provide the vaccine, and then the whole clinic is operated under an MDH authority with those nursing pool nurses.
Okay. Well, I find that pretty disturbing when you had cited earlier some of the issues with the handling of the TrueCare vaccines, and to hear potentially that the state's own vaccination program with its own employees are feeling compromised in their licenses or in being able to follow CDC guidance or proper compliance measures. That is obviously very troubling, and is, goes beyond just what we saw with TrueCare. I guess my last question, I'll turn over to my colleagues here, are to me, it sounds like, since you are still actively an employee with the Department of Health, that the retaliation and the retribution that you're experiencing are intended to set an example of your circumstance, that individuals and whistleblowers who speak up are punished. And there are actually state statutes in place to protect whistleblowers. And, I wonder whether those protections are adequate given the circumstances that you've been experiencing and have conveyed to us here. But do you feel like the retribution has gotten worse? And are you being set as an example to those clinicians or other colleagues who remain? And is the message being sent here that they cannot speak or should not speak, or they will also experience similar retaliation?
I think what happened in my situation was definitely a strong message to the clinical staff and even the non-clinical staff, because there were even non-clinical staff that had tried to speak up and were told, you need to stay quiet or you'll lose your job. So across the board, that is the way people feel. But there are continuous actions happening, even though I'm essentially out of view for most of my colleagues, and some people have even asked if I still work for the state. They don't even know if I'm around. The people who are still there are continually experiencing the same repression. The compliance officer I mentioned today, I tried to raise an issue where I identified a report that was falsified in order to relaunch a vendor that was not safe to relaunch. And instead of the response being that they were going to investigate it, she's being pulled aside for counsel. So that's happening today. This is what's the mode of how they fix things, is to fix the individual that is reporting the problem.
I see. It seems concerning that this is the equivalent of a public shaming of a whistleblower, and serves as intimidation to others who may be willing or wanting to speak up. I'll turn it over to my co-chair, Chairman Corman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, Dr. Ray, I apologize. Early in the hearing, I referred to you with an incorrect title, so I apologize for that. And thank you for being here and sharing your story. Obviously, it takes a lot of courage to do what you've done. And so I am curious, what rationale did they give for your shift in position?
When I was informed of my demotion, I wasn't told a reason why I was being demoted. It's more matter of fact. I have made a decision of what to do with you, or I have decided to do this with you, is kind of the verbiage I have received. I was initially told I was going to be helping in the congregate care group to help write policies, because that was a consistent message I got from all my leadership, is what I was good at policy. They often might say that I was not good at operations. And I think from their perspective, what they meant was I wasn't good at operations the way they wanted to do them. But that was a criticism I received at a prior day. So I wasn't really given a true reason during that discussion. However, 4 days prior, I had a call from he was the director of the branch and I was the deputy. He had called me asking if I could cover one of the sites because we were so short when TrueCare was paused. And I am a clinician, I'm a PA. But because I was in that deputy role, I wasn't a field clinician as much as I used to be. I was much more in a leadership position of that whole branch. And I explained to him I could not cover a site because I had not been trained at the level of detail that I would need to be. And I wasn't even CPR certified at the moment. So he was very angry that I wasn't willing to do it anyway. And I tried to explain to him that we were clearly short on staff. We were not able to accommodate all the sites that TrueCare left us with when we suspended them. And I asked him, could he please explain that we are just limited and we need to explain to the secretary what we can and can't do. And he just was very loud on the phone and said, that's just not going to happen, and hung up. So it was short after that conversation that the following Monday, I was informed of my demotion. So I'm assuming a lot of it had to do with that conversation, but he didn't reference it.
So since that time, have you asked why your job was changed, why you were demoted?
Since that time, he hasn't spoke to me directly. The person who demoted me speaks through my supervisor. So I've tried to email him to ask him questions in the past, such as my supervisor was suddenly removed and I was ignored for a month. And I was trying to email him and he was never responding. So I tried to email the director who demoted me. He wouldn't speak to me. Someone finally replaced my supervisor and he was not aware I was on his team. So I alerted him that I was still around. And then I tried to discuss this with him again. And I'll say this just to help myself with verbiage. I tried to email Jack Forsyth, who was the director who demoted me. But he instead had a side call with my new supervisor, and the supervisor told me, Jack said, we can make your role whatever we want it to be. So I don't get direct communication from him unless it's an angry email, but I think he has distanced himself.
Yeah, forgive me, you might have said this during your testimony, but did the demotion affect your compensation?
It did in a way, because I was working very long hours. And so I was receiving overtime and I was living at that means. When I was demoted, I was instructed by my supervisor that he was told to make sure I do not work overtime. So that, of course, affected my pay.
Right. So there was no change in the base compensation, but you're no longer authorized to work overtime. So obviously it affects the final compensation.
Right. So my paycheck drastically changed, but on my contract, the pay is the same.
Great. And thank you for clarifying that. And just to sort of bottom line it for me, it sounds to me like what you're saying is when these issues are raised to the Department of Health at the levels above you, they are not investigated to even determine if they're true or not. They're just sort of swept under the rug.
Right. The issue is not investigated. The person is. So even when I tried to remind the TrueCare vaccines were not being addressed, I was told that I was making accusations of the state, even though Jack was in the same meetings with me a couple months prior. So they're trying to act like it didn't exist and trying to say I had a personal problem. So that is the direction. And then they asked me to provide a list of all the sites I was aware of that had problems, because they only wanted to look into what I was aware of, not look at the actual sites to figure out what's going on wrong with the sites.
And so the True Value ones were taken sort of offline. Those concerns eventually were heard. Why were those heard, but not the broader issues that you've raised? Do you have any insight into that?
I think the main reason is because it was finally publicized in the Baltimore Sun.
Right. So,
because there were no calls until after it came out in the media.
Right. So nothing focuses the attention like a breaking news alert.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you again, Dr. Ray.
Thank you.
Thank you. I did have a follow-up question. I'd like to know, I know that you'd gone to the state and it sounded like you've been bounced around the Office of Audits and Compliance and the Office of Inspector General, and then the Equal Employment Opportunity Office at the Department of Budget and Management. And as was cited earlier, it was really only through media attention that some of these concerns were taken seriously. Can you tell us and bring us up to speed on the status of the federal HHS investigation that's going on? Because I know that there is a federal investigation that's taking place as part of your whistleblower concern.
Sure. So I've had an interview with the officer who's leading that investigation, and she requested all the documents. But so far, the documents I sent her, she was unable to receive. She's asked me to resend them. But there's just been some confusion where she thought I was making additional reports when I was not. So there's been some administrative confusion. But the main thing that I learned was she wanted me to understand that her investigation takes 3 to 5 years. So with everything else I was trying to deal with and take care of, it became more challenging for me to prioritize giving her the information she needed. But I still intend to do so because I want to follow through with whatever opportunities I have.
Got it. Thank you. And when you're describing some of the vaccination programs that were taking place in the state, a lot of it was being conducted through contractors and other firms that were being contracted by the state. Is there a concern that a lot of the experience of individuals that are conducting these programs and vaccination sites and testing are all contractors? I think you have a unique view of the department, having been a clinical person involved in the department, that with these contractors being brought in, they're not state employees that will retain any employment potentially after the pandemic. And a lot of the capabilities and knowledge that's being brought in and cultivated within the department could very well easily leave after the pandemic is over and these contracts end. In some ways, it's almost as though we're creating a shadow health department through contractors that have no permanence at the department that could leave after the contract's gone and really gut the department itself. Do you have any sense from your perspective as a clinician at the department, the direction that that's going?
The direction, I'm not sure where it's going, but I think that type of composition did drastically affect the ability for us to be at the quality that we should have been. Even though I am contracted to the state, I'm contracted directly to the state. So I did view myself as a state employee in the sense that my client is the public, and I wanted to do my best to take care of the public. But a lot of state employees understand that we are in a short contract, sometimes as short as 4 months. And they wanted to make the most of that contract and make sure they lasted 4 months or whatever it was. So there is a large incentive to, like I mentioned, stay in business and make sure that they are needed and that the work that they are doing stays needed. But added to that, outside of the folks like myself who are contracted directly to the state, the larger majority of people who are hired as a secondary contract, such as Hagerty or EY or Qualivis. And those folks view us as their clients. So a Hagerty employee, for example, is meant to do what the state needs, and they view us as the state, even though we're a contractor for the state. So that's why if you ask a Hagerty person to provide a report, a status report, and how the sites are going, they will tell you it's going great because they want to represent us well, and they want to always provide a good picture. But it also means that they're the wrong person to ask for that report. So we have people who are from Hagerty in different places that cannot have the correct footing to give the right perspective. But unfortunately, even the director of the entire program is Hagerty. And when I had consulted the staffing lead for Hagerty, when he was the prior chief of staff and he was ignoring my emails about the concerns I was having with issues with my director, he explained that he can't really operate as chief of staff because his job is to do what the state needs, and he's not allowed to dictate to state. So even though they select him as a chief of staff, he couldn't even do the job he was given. So that creates a lot of dysfunction because you're going to dead ends constantly. I can't get chief of staff support if he can't act as a chief of staff, and I can't get director support if that's not the role he's allowed to operate in. So the dynamics of where people come from and who they actually work for do really influence the whole thing. And amongst it all, we don't have a true government person who can try to keep order of it all. So it just tends to run with however the favoritism is happening at the time.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that perspective, Dr. Ray. I find very troubling the retaliation that you're experiencing. I think it's unacceptable, and disturbing that the retaliation is still going on, particularly with you highlighting the fact that there's still safety issues that are present, that it's not just with the outside contractors who were administering the vaccine like TrueCare, but that there are concerns with MDH's own employees, their own internal program, who are vaccinating the public. And so I want to thank you for coming forward and doing a service. And I'm sorry that you're sidelined and experiencing the retribution that you are. I want to apologize on behalf of the state as well. It's not the treatment that we would expect whistleblowers to experience when they bring up important concerns like this, and that's why there are protections in the statute for individuals like yourself. Clearly, there's been a breakdown of responsibility in the handling of your whistleblower concerns, and I think that the public owes you a debt of gratitude. I see that Delegate Harrison has her hand up. Go ahead, Delegate Harrison.
Thank you. Just really quickly, as I stated earlier, being threatened or bullied while attempting to do your job is never acceptable. And I think that Chair Lamb just expressed that in the most concise manner. Did I understand you correctly that you're actually a contract employee? You're not an employee of MDH? Did I misunderstand?
To be fair, it's been confusing. I was told I'm a state employee and I'm referred to as a state employee internally. But I suppose through my actions of trying to go through these reports and get support, it was clarified that I'm not a true state employee. For example, I can't hold my colleagues now to the ethics law because we're an SPS contract to MDH. So there seems to be a challenge where we're somewhat in limbo, I guess. But it's I view myself as a state employee as far as my obligations to the public, but I have been told as a contractor to the state, even though I'm directly contracted to the state and MDH is my employer, I'm not supposed to consider myself a state employee.
So you don't have a PIN, a personal identification number?
I do.
Personnel.
I do.
Oh, all right. So yes, that is very confusing.
Yes.
My other question, just simply, you highlighted and went through a lot in your testimony of things that you've gone through and the communications that you've had. I'm assuming that you have all of that communication in writing, as well as those, what you have, those to whom you've directed, and then the responses. I'm assuming you have that. Is that correct?
I have an exorbitant amount of documentation. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you, Delegate Harrison. To Dr. Ray, I think even in your role, as well as the folks that you were working with who were in your same status, you did sign agreements to abide by the public ethics law. Is that correct?
Yes, we were actually sent a renewal where we had to re-sign it in September. But yes.
Okay. All right. Well, seeing no further questions, I want to thank you again for coming forward. I am sorry about the experience that you've had. I think you are doing a service to the state by coming forward and making the public aware of some of the concerns that are certainly present with the vaccines that were administered to residents of Maryland. And I commend you for coming forward, because we recognize that from your testimony, there are others who are still there and concerned about speaking up. I know that you had never asked to be a whistleblower in coming into this role, but in bringing attention to these concerns to your supervisors, I think you did the right thing. And so I appreciate your service to the state and for sticking around, because you certainly don't have to, but it's obvious that you care about your work and whom you work with. And thank you again for your willingness to be here.
Thank you guys for all your time. We appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ray. In closing, just to remind the audience that we did ask the Secretary to attend. He has declined to be here. And so while the Secretary is not present, I want to, in my closing, I want to communicate to the leadership at MDH to know that we in the legislature are watching. We take our oversight responsibility seriously. And we're not the only ones in the legislature who have heard these concerns. I've heard from other colleagues who are alarmed at the loss of experience at our local health departments and mismanagement of mobile vaccination programs at MDH. What happened to these local health officers and this whistleblower is unacceptable. And we in the legislature will remain vigilant in ensuring that our health officers are supported and that whistleblowers in our state agencies are protected. And to those in the Department of Health who may still be engaged in bullying, retaliation, or retribution of our state employees who are really just trying to do their job and to do the right thing, I urge you to stop the retaliation now. We have no reservations about continuing to highlight concern. I have no reservations about continuing to highlight concerns that we hear. And if you're a current or former employee with concerns about bullying, reprisal, retaliation, mismanagement, or unfair treatment, please do not hesitate to reach out to us because we would like to hear from you, and that falls under the purview of this committee. With that, let me turn it over to my co-chair, Chairman Corman, for any closing remarks on his end.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again for your work on this, which I know expands beyond just this joint committee. I think you and Delegate Harrison did a great job of noting that people should be treated with respect, even if they're county health officers, to say nothing of, just rank and file employees of a state department or agency. So thank you for highlighting that, and thank you for convening us today.
All right, well, thank you to all the members of the committee. We will, in all likelihood, reconvene sometime after session's over. This concludes the hearing before the Joint Committee on Fair Practice and State Personnel Oversight. Thank you and have a good